Do women undervalue themselves? This is a story we hear frequently in the media, that women fail to take proper credit for their workplace performance. Men supposedly suffer from the opposite problem, being overconvinced of their worth, and this discrepancy leads to many inequities. Can this possibly be true? That's my subject on today's Fiamengo File. I'm Janice Fiamengo of the University of Ottawa. If you like this video, or even if you don't, please subscribe to Studio Brûlé. If you put the phrase "women undervalue themselves" into Google, you'll find an abundance of studies about how women underrate their overall job performance. If you put the phrase "men undervalue themselves" into Google, the same studies about women come up. Obviously, no researchers of any stature are exploring whether men suffer from lack of confidence in the workplace. Let's look at the kinds of claims that are being made. A 2015 study in London's Daily Mail asserted that women generally ask for lower pay than men do. According to the report, women applying for jobs asked on average for 4,000 British pounds, that's around 6,000 US dollars, less per year than men did for the same job. And the gender gap widened at the senior level. For the more prestigious positions, it seems women's undervaluing of their worth was even more marked, with as much as a £10,000 or $15,000 discrepancy. The Daily Mail tells us that, quote, expected salaries varied by industry, with women asking for 29% less than men in accountancy, 22% less in banking, 21% less in the energy sector, and 18% lower in education, end quote. So, what do we make of such findings? Well, as you know, I'm not a social scientist, so I invite you to tell me where I'm wrong here. What strikes me is that the report provided almost no context for the numbers. We're told that women had, quote, the same experience and qualifications as the men in the various fields, so we're supposed to conclude that the women simply don't recognize what they're worth. That's the only conclusion suggested by the report. The fact is, though, that there is no such thing as the same when we're measuring a worker's quality. Each person's experience, skills, motivation, self-discipline, drive, focus, and work ethic are unique. We weren't told, and I don't know it could be ascertained, whether the women had performed equally well as their male counterparts in previous positions, or whether they were equally intelligent, hardworking, ambitious, and capable as the men. What the study doesn't tell us is that it's quite possible and even likely that some of the women applying for positions in accounting or banking were looking for a job that allowed them greater flexibility in hours or more time off or a less high-pressure environment in return for the more modest salary that they sought, in which case they wouldn't be undervaluing themselves, but recognizing realistically what they were worth to their employer and to what extent they were willing to commit to the job. On the other hand, perhaps money was just not a major factor in their lives because they were financially supported by their current or former husbands. Perhaps men tend to seek a higher salary because men have for centuries been the ones who bore the primary responsibility for supporting their families. None of that was, or could be, I guess, a part of the report, and the clear implication was simply the usual one, that most industries are happy to take advantage of women's uncertainty about what they deserve to be paid, and that this is unfair. There is an obvious counterclaim that wasn't considered in the article, which is that if women are really consistently willing to accept less pay, dramatically less pay it seems, for the same job performance, for bringing the exact same skills and dedication and ability to the job, then why would accountancy firms and banks and energy companies ever hire men if they have to overpay them for the same level of commitment and professionalism? In fact, it turns out that the story isn't even what its first few paragraphs lead us to believe, because further into the story we learn that, for example, quote, a qualified male accountant expected to earn £47,000 in their next role compared to just £36,400 for women with the same experience. But the gender gap narrowed in the manufacturing industry and the legal sector to just 9%, and in the IT and security industry, women actually asked for higher pay, albeit just 2% more, end quote. Now, wait a moment. Isn't that quite significant in a report stating in its headline and opening statements that women always ask for less than their male counterparts, that now it turns out that in the IT and security industries, women are asking for more than men? Doesn't that suggest that the story is not about women's lower self-esteem, but about complex industry-specific variables and men's and women's differing histories within them? But that's not as interesting a conclusion as what we are offered in the article, which tells us at the end that according to feminist activist Fiona Hathorn, quote, stereotypical unconscious biases are alive and kicking in the UK, end quote. There are a lot of these kinds of studies around to promote the wage gap myth and to encourage people to take a parity pledge to value women's and men's achievements equally. To me, they often seem like reports from life on Mars in their claim that women don't think highly enough of themselves. That's never been my experience of women. In 2013, there was a study whose results were published in Wired magazine that found that women consistently underrate their on-the-job performance when working in a successful group alongside a man. The subjects of the study were told that they were working on a team project with a male colleague, though they never met or interacted with that colleague. At the end, when the results were pooled, they were told the project was a success and they were asked to rate their contribution. We're told that the women tended to give more credit to their male co-workers than they took for themselves. So this seems incontrovertible evidence again of low self-esteem. But there are problems with how the study was set up. Specifically, the women were told they were working on a project that men have consistently excelled at. They were told that 86% of those working in the field were male. So the women were, in a sense, primed to underrate their performance. How they would have rated it if they'd been told that they were working on a task in which women generally excel, well, that's another question. But ultimately, the real issue, as in the previous study, is that we know nothing about the actual performances of the women in the study, whether they deserved equal credit for the team's work. And this is the elephant in the room with so many of these studies and assertions about how women feel about their treatment in the workplace. What are women worth in the job market? Let's say, for argument's sake, that the results of the studies are generally true, which I'm not sure there are. But never mind, let's say that women are inclined to rate their work-related achievements lower than men rate theirs, especially in traditionally male-dominated fields. If that is true, what might it mean? Where does women's perception of their own performance come from? We know the feminist answer to this question. Women's lower self-evaluation comes from the messages all around women in the culture, which is apparently a woman undervaluing culture that doesn't believe women can do certain kinds of jobs as well as men. This is the perfect feminist answer, of course, because it doesn't have to be proved, simply asserted. Feminists will point to images of women in the media that supposedly objectify them as sexual objects and diminish their other capacities. They never mention, of course, that one can find similar images of men and that much of the so-called objectification can also be perceived as a celebration of female beauty. Critics dwell at length on trivial incidents such as Tim Hunt's joke about women in science labs, neglecting to mention that his joke was followed up by an emphatic declaration of support for women in science. But basically, if one man anywhere says something that can be perceived as less than 100% over the moon about a woman, that supposedly strikes a shattering blow to all women's self-esteem. At the same time, these critics have to gloss over the many positive messages about women that our culture pumps out daily. Does anyone really believe that a majority or even a minority of mothers are telling their daughters that they're inferior, or that the predominantly female teachers in a pro-feminist pedagogical environment are telling female students that they're inferior, or that team coaches or drama instructors or phys ed instructors or dance teachers or counselors or politicians or news commentators or journalists or judges or Judeo-Christian religious leaders are giving them that message? The fact is that our culture is saturated with adoring messages telling girls not only that they can do anything they set their mind to. I was told this explicitly in the early 1970s when I started school. Not only that, but girls are told that they are superior to the violence-prone and sexually depraved males with whom they share their society. If it were really true that our culture is misogynist, we would expect to find a consistent pattern of negative messages with very little on the positive side, wouldn't we? And in a society that did not value women, would we really have so many studies worrying about the fact that women don't properly value themselves? Other critics will say, well, it's not so much the messages that women receive, it's the fact that we don't have 50% parity in Parliament, in the boardrooms, on the Supreme Court, and so on. So in other words, women recognize the discrepancy between the messages they receive and the reality on the ground. But this doesn't really explain things either, because the fact is that the reality on the ground has changed dramatically over the last half century, so much so that one would expect women, if they were judging on that basis, to feel euphoria about women's possibilities. We've had a steady increase in women's participation in formerly masculine spheres at all levels of politics, running companies, completing graduate degrees, practicing law and medicine, and so on. So an objective analysis of the advantageous placement of women in business and the professions should create ever-increasing confidence in women. So, why then would some women's self-perception of ability be so seemingly out of whack with the modern world? Well, what if it isn't out of whack? What if the women's self-judgment is a result of years of knowingly letting men do a majority share of the work? The studies we've looked at don't inquire into what actually happens on a variety of jobs where women and men work together. And if they did, they might well find that, yes, there are inequalities, but not the kind the studies seek. In road construction work, for example, we've all seen women holding the stop sign while the men shovel the hot asphalt. In building construction, as a friend of mine reports, measures to increase women's participation have consistently meant inefficiencies and accidents. On farms, as my husband remembers from his youth, the men did the truly back-breaking work. In the chemical industry, as Steve tells me from first-hand experience, women watch the control board in warmth and comfort while men work in the freezing rain with dangerous, heavy equipment on high scaffolding. In the military, as I'm told by a friend with decades of experience, the pretense of equality covers over the reality that women simply cannot and do not do many of the combat-related drills and daily tasks of the men, and that there is a massive cover-up involved so that the women themselves are protected from having to confront their own inability. In high-level scientific research in academia, as a friend in the field reports, men simply tend to be more intensely focused than women. He's noticed that as he and all his friends age, most of the women are wanting to step back from their careers in order to do other things, while the men are focusing even more energetically on their research work. Perhaps it is the case that women's feeling that the man on the team contributed more may be due to their general experience of men contributing more. What if the fact is that a lot of women recognize that they haven't earned the professional positions they've been given, either individually or as a group, and that despite all the kudos women regularly receive, overall men often do outperform women, especially in the technical and scientific fields, even with the game rigged against men as it now is in terms of preferential recruitment, hiring, and promotions. In fact, the preferential recruitment, hiring, and promotions probably increase the number of superior performers among men because it guarantees that men must earn their positions by having to be significantly better than the women they compete against. I saw this in hiring competitions in my workplace during the late 1990s and early 2000s over and over again. What if the fact is that a lot of women can't help but see all around them that men in significantly higher numbers continue to do the most demanding and difficult work as well as the most prized work from the standpoint of cultural flourishing, the work of invention, the work of high-level research that wins Nobel Prizes and other forms of recognition, the work involving the longest hours and the greatest dedication. If women look to the past, to that long roll call of greatness in the areas of scientific discovery, medical research, technological invention, and artistic greatness, it's an overwhelmingly male roll call, but they can tell themselves that was because women were held back then. Well, what about now? Where are the great female composers? Where are the great female visual artists? Where are the great female inventors? Where are the great pioneers in medical research or pure science research? There are some brilliant women, certainly, but they remain a small minority, despite at least a half century in which women were entirely free and enthusiastically encouraged to pursue greatness. Just to be clear, I'm not saying that women are inferior to men in their overall contribution to society, not at all. But I am saying that in certain areas of creativity and intellectual attainment, in those areas that most explicitly have built and continue to build culture, men seem to have an edge, not only for purely intellectual reasons, but that must play a role, but for evolutionarily derived reasons of temperament, attitude, character, and sheer drive. And I suspect that for the foreseeable future, no matter how much society encourages women and tells them they can do and be whatever they want, and no matter how much artificial equality is created through parity pledges for boardrooms and corporate leadership and political office, men will continue to outpace women in certain areas of dazzling achievement, and women will continue to recognize it, even if only grudgingly and with resentment. And if my hunch is right, all the special measures in the world will not increase women's self-respect. In fact, those special measures will have the opposite effect, increasing the imposter syndrome, the resentment, and the need to seek out yet more false evidence of discrimination. And that's really too bad, because women should recognize men's historical and present achievements with admiration and gratitude, since those male achievements have been so generously shared. Let's at least stop pretending that women wrongly undervalue themselves and that yet more money needs to be wasted coaching women about how great they are and creating artificial conditions in which they can feel valued. Where individual women do excel, obviously their achievements should be recognized, and women's special role in childbearing and child rearing deserves respect when it's done well. But let's be honest about the relative contributions of men and women, those standout areas requiring special brilliance, tenacity, single-mindedness, and self-sacrifice. There's no shame in a society that doesn't achieve absolute parity between men and women. But there is shame in forcing everyone to act as if absolute parity is desirable or necessary.